Hey, good morning, class. I hope you've had a great week. I hope you had a great fourth. My hope is that after watching last week's video, that maybe you took some of my words to heart and really spent some time this past week just looking for blind spots, just asking yourself, asking God just to reveal to you any potential blind spots that may exist in your life as it deals to all the matters that are going on in our world today. I know it's so easy for us to get really kind of frozen in what we already believe and just trust that everything is correct and right, and not really pausing to look in our own lives and to really try to dig in some areas that may be uncomfortable. But I hope and pray you did that. Look for those blind spots. I know that God will reveal them to us. I encourage you to continue to pray for our country, that through all of this, we know that God is going to work good for us and glory for Him. But He never promised that all of that would be easy. And so we're still continuing to work through, as a nation, all the intricacies of this. But I just encourage you to continue to look into your own life and to see how, as a people, as a church, that we can be about looking for the betterment of the church, of our country, of our individual communities. And so be looking for those blind spots and just be open to see what God's going to do in your life. Today, I want us to kind of pause. I'm not going to continue on with new text, but I want to do something that I think we would have naturally happened in Sunday school over the last few weeks had we actually been together. Because the question would have been raised as we talk about Abraham, really at this point still Abram, but same guy, of course. I think the question would have come up naturally just about his life. It's so easy to follow one of two courses when we deal with Abram. Would be to just lift him up as this paragon of faith and righteousness. Or we could go the other route. Sorry, my phone kind of messed up there. I don't know if you caught that. But we could lift him up as like this paragon of faith and righteousness, or we can just blast him. One of the two. We can write him off. I remember early on in my Christian walk, I said something about Abraham, just being a man of faith or something along those lines. And somebody that I know was kind of quick to point out, oh, well, he did all of these things wrong. And yeah, he did. He did. In fact, I want to just briefly run down a list of his, of some things that he said and did. And I just want you, as we walk through this, and we're going to jump back to Romans 4 just ever so briefly this morning, I just want you to stop and think about, as I run through this list, constantly put it in the context of your own life. All right, put it in the context of your own life. Maybe even keep King David out there, or maybe even Solomon. We're not going to talk about them, but you know their stories. But I want you to think about it in the context of you for a moment. And let's just run down and this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but I literally just sat down for a few minutes and just went through my Bible and just penciled out kind of yays and nays, if you will. Chapter 12, verse 4. So Abraham went. God called him out. He said, I want you to go to this land. And the text says quite simply, so Abram went. I put that into a column of faith. I mean, here we have this pagan worshiper. God says go. This God that he's not really met before says go, and he goes. In the same text, when he gets there, he says in the same chapter, there's a famine in the land. So Abram went to Egypt. Think about it like, okay, this great act of faith and trusting in God, and then he goes down to Egypt. And then in verse 13 in chapter 12, he says to Sarai, say you're my sister. I think most of us would not chalk these up to be great acts of faith. So we see him believing, and then we see him kind of just maybe not distrusting, but maybe it is distrusting. But it's not Abraham went, right? Go to chapter 13, and this is after God has stepped in, intervened, prevented Sarai from being assaulted in any way, and then God just comes before everybody and lays this thing down. That's a horrible way of saying all that, but you follow me, right? God's made it right. Verse 13, chapter 1. So Abram went up from Egypt. And so Abraham's getting his senses back, and he's headed back. He's going back to the promised land. Chapter 13, verse 4, so Abram called upon the name of the Lord. He builds an altar. He's worshiping. Okay, we can chalk that up to something good, right? Verse 9 of chapter 13, he says this to Lot, is not the whole land before you? And so here, God has promised this land to Abraham and his descendants, but so Abraham's just saying, hey, look, we're not going to have any strife. Look, he says to Lot, look around, and you go pick. And I see trust here. I see faith. And we talked about this in some previous lessons, I know. In verse 18, chapter 13, we see Lot go towards Sodom, but Abram moved his tent to Hebron and built an altar. And so we see a man, I think in some ways, if we were to stop at the end of chapter 13, what we see is a man who's a pagan worshiper. He's confronted by God. God tells him to go do something, and he goes and he does it. And then he begins to struggle. And I'm going to use the word waver, but if you remember from Romans 4, Paul says he uses that word waver. And we need to come back to that at the end. But I'm going to use that word. We see this kind of fluctuation in Abraham. Does that sound familiar? Right now I'm looking at my phone, and it's set to video me. And so I'm like literally looking in a mirror, and I'm like, yeah, that actually sounds pretty familiar. I really don't have to go very far to see someone who's done some very, very similar things, right? That's why I ask you to really think about you as you just contemplate this text, because this is me. I'll do something really cool and really God-honoring, at least I hope I do, and then I'll do something really boneheaded, which I know I do. And that this is Abraham. This is us. Go back to, let's look at a few more. Chapter 14, verse 20. Abraham gave a tenth of everything. This is when, after he has rescued Lot from the different kings, and he's going before the king of Salem, Melchizedek, the king of Sodom, and he's talking to and he's interacting with Melchizedek, and he gives him a tenth of everything. And then verse 22, talking to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord that I would take nothing. And he goes on to say, lest you say, I made Abraham rich, or Abram rich. And so you see him, I'm just trusting God. I think about Abram here. I think he's trusting God. And as we talked about in that lesson, we go into chapter 15, verse 6, and Abram believed God. And we see God really begin to bless Abram here. And he really kind of draws this initial loose covenant that he made with him, these promises that he made. And it's in chapter 15, he really nails it down. God nails it down. He says, go out and look at the stars. And we've talked a little bit about that already. But he believed God. But then we get to chapter 16, which we haven't gotten to yet. So I'm moving a little bit ahead, but I'm just going to do it loosely and quickly. Chapter 16, verse 2, so Abraham listened to Sarah. Abram listened to Sarah. Now, this had to deal with Hagar. And you're thinking, and we struggle to wrap our minds around this, really. I think most of us do. God's prevented me from becoming pregnant. Here's my servant Hagar. I'm gonna hold off on that. We're gonna talk more about that when we get there. But I think we would all chalk this up to be like, yeah, you're not really trusting God there, are you, Abraham? Chapter 17, verse 3, Abram fell on his face before God. All right, now we'll look at the context when we get there, but he fell on his face before God. That's humility. But then you go down 14 verses later to chapter 17, Abram fell on his face and laughed. Now this is when you read it, you think, okay, Abraham, is Abraham at this point. You're not believing God when God just tells you that, oh, Sarah's going to have a baby. She's nearly 100 years old, and he falls on his face and laughs, and he seems to disbelieve that Sarah could become pregnant. We'll talk more about that when we get there. To me, that's not just a hardcore, I believe you, God. But again, put all of this in the context of you for a moment. Do you ever do this? Do you ever live your life in sections and segments of your life fully grounded in faith and making faith-based decisions, and you are trusting God no matter what? And then it seems like moments later, you do something that seems to completely lack trust in God. So we have to be careful when we look at some of these individuals in the Bible. It's hard for us to put ourselves completely in their shoes because we can't, because they lived in some cases thousands of years ago. But I think sometimes we hold them to a standard and we micro analyze every segment of their life and say, well, how could they? Look in the mirror. How could we? How could I? Right? And so we've got to remember that they're human. That they're human, and God is working in their lives, yes, in some very profound ways, but really, He's working in their lives the same way He's working in our lives. We have not received a covenant that we are going to be the father of a mighty nation. No, none of us watching this that has occurred. But God makes promises to us, and He works in our lives, and He is challenging us on a regular basis, and He is striving with us to help us look more like Jesus. Let's look at just a few more. Chapter 20, verse 2. This is Abram to King Abimelech. She is my sister. And this is when you just hold up your head and you're like, literally, we're going down this road again? But then again, I'm looking in this phone at my mirror and I'm like, have I ever committed a singular sin more than once? Yep. And so have you. And we read the text and we just read it in a way and we just become dumbfounded. And rightfully so, but I just encourage you to look in that mirror and say, really? Am I doing this again? Go up and read Romans chapter 7. All right, we focused a lot on Romans 4, and we looked at some other texts last week, but I want you to read Romans chapter 7, and you know the passage. This is where Paul says in this really kind of cool, like lawyerly type language, lawyerly, I'm not sure that's a word, but we'll go with it, that, I don't do the things that I want to do, and then I know that I should do, and I'm paraphrasing, but these things that I know are wrong and I don't want to do, those are the things that I do. Sound familiar, doesn't it? All right? And that's Abraham, that's me, and that's you. That's the church, that's all humanity. And so we are rightly confused by this, but we must not divorce it from our lives. We must take a step back and look and see us doing the same thing. And then we get to perhaps one of the greatest verses, and I'll stop with my list here, and we're going to move up to Romans 4 just briefly. He says, the Lord will provide. And this is in chapter 22, that's verse 14, but we'll get there in a few weeks when we deal with Abraham and Isaac, and this is the sacrifice of Isaac that thankfully God stopped. He provided the ram, and we see Abraham, he lifts the knife, he binds the son, he lifts the knife. I look forward to working through this passage, but we see multiple evidences of his maturing faith where he has grown in the Lord to the point where he's willing to raise the knife. And none of us, absolutely none of us, can put ourselves in his shoes there and say, oh yeah, I'd be willing to do that. Yeah, if God told me to do that, I'd be willing to do that. I mean, just think about that. Say that out loud. Think about what Abraham was willing to do here because of what his trust in God. And so we think about this list and we see this ebb and flow, right? We see it. And let's go back to Romans 4. I'm back in verse 19. I read this last week. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead since he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No distrust made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew. And I think that's one of the most important clauses in all of that. But he grew. And so when we think about that word waver, I think it's very important that we pause. I used that word a few moments ago because when you look at it, I just read a text where it's like this, right? It certainly seems like he's going up and down. And so some of it might be, just kind of like grammar stuff, syntax type stuff. But when I read this and I stop and think about it, I think we have to look at it from a really big picture type perspective. Not that he never, on like I said, let's just say a daily basis, just for argument's sake, not that he never went up and down, not that he never made mistakes, but if you look at Abram's life, in the list that I just read, we see him going from a pagan who, okay, he follows God, and then he immediately begins to make mistakes because he's so young in his faith, but he grew, to quote Paul, but he grew. In chapter 12, he wasn't ready to raise the knife over his promised son. He wasn't ready to do any of that, but he grew. So in a nuanced daily way, yeah, there was some definite wavering there as he is growing. He is working through the process. In a New Testament lens, we would call that sanctification. He is growing in the likeness of Christ, becoming more like Christ, as it were. That's what we would say in our own context. We are becoming more like Christ. But does he ever, in the sense of wavering, does he ever abandon God? Waver to the point where he leaves and abandons? No, he doesn't. He remains firm. He learns these lessons through his own mistakes and through God's faithfulness to him. Aren't you thankful this morning for a faithful God who remains faithful and endearing to us even when we absolutely don't deserve it? How many times have we gone before the world and said, oh, she's my sister? Right? How many times have we been Peter in the garden? Doesn't that sound kind of familiar? Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know the man. And in our day and age, we can do that by both being vocal and being silent. All right? We can do it in both ways. Sometimes our silence speaks volumes. I know I've been talking a lot about this lately. Just the need to not just let our facial expressions communicate something, but our words communicate something, and really needing to stand up and vocalize, our feelings on what's going on as it deals with particular race relations in our country, and just the sad reality of honestly how prejudiced so many within the church still are. And refusing to see the injustices that are being done. And we need to be more vocal about that. I've said a little bit about that in previous lessons, but we need to be saying more and more and more. Because in our silence, we can become complicit to what's going on. All right? Abraham didn't waver. He didn't waver. He had some ups and downs, yes. All right, but I think Paul is talking about the big picture and what we see in a man who continued to trust God. No distrust, I'm back in Romans 4, verse 20. No distrust made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God. We saw him do that. Fully convinced that God was able to do what he promised. 21, fully convinced. You don't raise that knife if you're not fully convinced. You don't go out into this world and speak up and speak truth if you're not fully convinced that God is real and a keeper of his promises and trustworthy and all of those things. He believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. All right, so let's not be guilty of lifting Abraham up as this paragon of faith and justice and righteousness and perfection. But let's also not be guilty of throwing him under the bus, so to speak, because he made some very real mistakes. I just encourage you to, again, to kind of look in the mirror and realize that we're guilty of all those same things. And when I say same, I don't mean like to the letter, right? But we're guilty of all of those same kinds of things. We have moments in our lives where we are on the mountaintop trusting God in all circumstances, right? And fully to the hilt. And then each of us can right now think of times in our lives where we're down in the valley, so to speak, and we're not trusting God. We're distrusting him. We're saying, she is my sister. We're saying the same types of things. And so I'd encourage you to just, kind of take this week and take this text and really just kind of think through the life of Abraham and look in the mirror and ask God to reveal those times where we're saying, she is my sister, or we're laughing. Do we fall down on our face and laugh before God because we're distrusting in that moment? But let's also remember the faithfulness of God and that he's got us, and he's promised. We hear Jesus promise in the New Testament, hey, look, no one's going to snatch you out of my hand. Jesus said it is finished. He has finished the work that secures us. But we've got a lot of room to grow into his likeness. And for us to do that, we've got to get real with ourselves. And that's my encouragement to you today. I hope that you have a blessed week, and I look forward to being back with you again soon. Take care now.